Hello, my name is Rafael Seiz, and in this learning object we're going to see the basic forms and uses of the passive voice in English, with a special emphasis in technical English. We will see the form, how to form the passive voice, to see some verb transformations. We will focus also on the transformation into the passive of constructions with verbs with two objects. And also we will have a look at the use of the passive verbs, and we will see some examples of passive and active sentences. The objectives are to learn how to write correct passive sentences, to change sentences from passive into active and vice versa correctly, and to be able to make passive sentences with a specific two-object verb sentences, and to learn how to use the passive voice properly in English. Here we have an example of an active and a passive sentence. In the active sentence, the object does the action, carries out an action. The verb is in the active form, and the object receives the consequences of this action. For example, the pilot monitors flight parameters. In a passive sentence, we have that the passive subject receives the action. It doesn't produces the action. The verb is in the passive form, as we will see in a minute, and sometimes we can include the person or the thing that carries out the action by means of the construction by plus the agent. For example, flight parameters are monitored by the pilot. The important thing is to know how to transform an active verb into passive verb and vice versa. But we have to bear in mind that only transitive verbs, that means verbs that can take objects or that are followed by objects, it can be one or two objects, only transitive verbs can be transformed into passive constructions. Some sentences containing certain verbs, therefore, cannot be transformed into passive sentences. Some of them contain verbs such as have, resemble, look like, equal, agree, with, mean, contain, hold, comprise, lack, suit, fit, become, etc. These are some of the most common ones. An important thing in passive voice construction is verbal transformations. The general rule is very, very clear. We put the subject of the passive sentence first, and then we use the verb, exactly the same tense of the verb to be, followed by the past participle of the corresponding verb. Here we have a summary, a list of the most important cases we can deal with. Present, present perfect, past, past perfect, future, etc. It doesn't mean how easy or complicated the verb is. The rule is mechanical. It's exactly the same. The car is, or the cars are designed, or for example, in a complicated verb form such as the present progressive, is exactly the same rule. The car or the cars is being or are being designed. It's exactly the same tense of the verb to be, followed by the past participle. Even with modal verbs. With modal verbs it's even easier. We use exactly the modal verb of the verb to be, in this case can be, should be, or whatever, then follow, as always, with the past participle. So this presents no complication, but you have to bear this in mind all the time when you write passive sentences. We have to mention the specific case of verbs that can take two different objects. Normally one of them is a personal object and the other one is a thing object. And in this case, we have two possible passive constructions. In the active, we have a subject doing the action, plus the verb, plus the indirect object, or the direct object. And we have two possible passive constructions. Taken the direct object of the active as the subject of the passive, or taking the indirect object as the subject of the passive sentence. Here we have the structures and an example to see it better. The an active sentence such as Professor Villa gave Jorge, an A could be translated into two different, but exactly the same, passive sentences. An A was given to Jorge by Professor Villa. In this case, we use the direct object, the object which is more closely related to the verb. But we also have the possibility of a second passive sentence. Jorge was given an A. In this case, we have no equivalent, for example, in the English language, so be careful with this. This is specific of the English language. Other similar verbs that can form a double passive sentence of this type are send, show, lend. These have in common that it's to send something to somebody, to show something to somebody, etc. They have two different objects. In this case, in the case of Professor Villa gave Jorge an A, the most common passive sentence is the second one, which does not exist, for example, in the Spanish language. Now we will move on to the use of the passive voice. Normally when we use it when we want to emphasize the action rather than the person or thing carrying out this action. For example, the terrorist activist has been caught. If we concentrate on the action as the most important thing. The second use is when the subject is a noun or an important. We don't know the object, it can happen. The tapestry was woven in the 16th century. We don't know who did it. The third use, when the subject does not wish to be mentioned for any reason. The cookie jar was broken. This was not relevant to include the person who carried out the action. And also we use the passive voice when we want to emphasize the person or thing being acted upon. This is another way of focusing on the action, but from the point of view of the person. For example, the child will be born this morning. We will see some examples of active and passive sentences. For example, for an active sentence such as this one with the two objects, they asked me some difficult questions at the interview. We have two possible passive sentences. Some difficult questions were asked to me at the interview, or the most common one, I was asked some difficult questions at the interview. This is an example of two verbs with two objects. Another example, workers would have revised all the pipes if someone had asked them to. The passive will be, all the pipes would have been revised by workers if they had been asked to. We follow exactly the same general mechanical rule. In this other example, hundreds of people followed him when he was walking in the street. The second active verb cannot be transformed into passive, but the first one can. He was followed by hundreds of people when he was walking in the street. In this case, it is important. Sometimes it is important to include the agent doing the action with by. One last example with a question: how much will they pay you? How much will you be paid? Or with modal verbs. They should present the real facts. The real facts should be presented. Exactly the same rule we were talking about before. As a conclusion, it is important to write and use the passive voice correctly in English, to know the rules to transform and to convert the active and passive sentences and the verbs. And you don't have to translate from your language. You have to actually use the corresponding passive construction in English, especially with two object verbs. Thank you very much, and I hope that this was useful for you. Thank you.